You are in the meeting now.
ஸ்ரீநாத், நீங்க மொபைல் டைரக்ஷன் மாத்தணும். ஓகே,
பெட்டர். குட் ஈவினிங் சார்.
குட் ஈவினிங். இதுக்குன்னே தனியா ஒரு இடம் செட் பண்ணி வச்சிருக்கீங்களா பின்னாடி ஒரு பேக்ரவுண்டோட?
ஒன்றும் இல்லை, விண்டோ அது அவ்வளோதான், வேற ஒன்றும் இல்லை. இதுக்கு ஒரு செட்டப் வேற பண்றாங்க. எப்படி இருக்கீங்க?
நியர்லி பேக் டு நார்மல், பட் கேசஸ் ஆல் ஓவர் ஆர் ஃபுல் மேன். மேத்தா ஃபுல். both metas are full with cases, covid cases.
அதான் சார், நேத்துக்கு
வானகரம் 2 floors plus one more floor they opened. In fact நேத்துக்கு மேத்தால 3 கேஸ் இல்லாம உங்க ஹாஸ்பிடல் காமிச்சிருக்காங்க. இடம் பெட் இல்லாம.
ஆமா, நுங்கம்பாக்கத்துக்கு.
ஆமா, wherever your since this thing is.
Yeah, they were planning to actually close it down. நுங்கம்பாக்கம்.
No,
மூடிலாம்.
increase. So 2 நாளா பயங்கர increase.
ஆமா சார். 3 ACS லாஸ்ட் அட்மிஷன் டே 3 பாசிட்டிவ்.
எல்லாமே பாசிட்டிவா இருக்கு மாதிரி. இப்போ போய் எவனுக்கு பண்றதுனே தெரியல. பேசாம கொஞ்சம் ஆன்ஜியோலாம் நிறுத்தி வைக்கலாமான்னு பாக்குறேன் கொஞ்ச நாளைக்கு. இல்லைன்னா கோவிட் பண்ணிட்டு பண்ணாலும் வந்து எவனுக்கு இருக்கு இல்லைன்னு வேற தெரியல. வேக்சின் சும்மா உப்புக்கிட்ட பானி ஸ்டோரி மாதிரி இருக்கு.
இல்ல, திரும்ப ரீசர்ஜன்ஸ் இருக்கு சார், என்ன நடக்க போகுதுன்னு தெரியல. பட் மார்டாலிட்டி கம்மியா இருக்குன்னு சொன்னாங்க.
கரெக்ட், தட் இஸ் ட்ரூ.
மார்டாலிட்டி பண்ண மாதிரி அந்த சிக்கா வர்றது இல்ல, பட் ரெக்கவரிங் அண்ட் கோயிங் அப். அதர்வைஸ்
Santosh, audio muted.
Dr. Prem sir, in the name of Santosh nu vandirukku sir.
adha Prem da paatha enna Santosh yaarunu paathitu irukken nanu.
Sir, you are in mute sir.
I am changing the name. It's my son's name. He frequently uses the laptop. Am I audible, sir?
Good, Prem.
Good evening, all. Ridin sir, I'm the tech support. Shall we go for live sharp 6:30 or we wait for some other speakers also?
Yeah.
Well, 2 minutes to go, man. For your live.
Yes, sir. Right now 6:27. We go for sharp 6:30 or we wait for the other speaker also.
I would request you to hold on and just hear Dr. Prabhakar will say you when to go live.
Another 2 minutes left, Ratin. We have.
Yeah. So we have,
Mani is there. Huh? Mani, are you audible? Pramod is there. Pramod, hi.
Yeah. Hello, Prabhakar. How are you?
There. Pramod is there. Manimaran is there. Where are you?
No, sir. Manisha has not selected the audio. That's why they're not able to hear our audio.
You should talk to him. Srinath is there. That's all. Srinath, Pramod, me are there. Mani is there. Mani can join. Even if you talk to him, we can join in with him later. Who's the first speaker? First talk is by Lijo. Dr. Lijo Varghese first and then Prem Kumar. We'll see if Dr. Lijo Varghese is in. If Dr. Lijo Varghese is in. Ilana, Prem, are you okay to go in?
I'm fine, sir. I'll finish it. No problem.
Lijo Varghese, Ritin.
Prabhakar sir, good evening.
Good evening. Who's that?
Good evening, sir.
Dr. Srinivasan here.
Hello, Dr. Srinivasan. Good evening.
Hello.
Good evening, yeah.
Hi, sir.
This is car number, TN76270.
இல்ல சார் அது ரிஜிஸ்ட்ரேஷன் நம்பர் சார். அப்பப்போ இந்த ஐஎம்ஏல எல்லாம் வந்து லாகின் பண்ணுவோம் இல்லையா? பிரேம்குமார் சார், குட் ஈவினிங்.
Hi. How are you?
I'm going on well. How are you doing?
Fine. Fantastic.
Pramod.
Hello.
No. I will just call you to introduce speakers. Mani, you're there? Can you hear us?
No, sir. They still not selected the speak the audio option.
Through his mobile. He has to select.
I already shared the chat.
All right. Let's see if he comes in. Otherwise, Srinath, I will call you to introduce the first talk. I think we have time already. Is it okay?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
All right. I will start.
Who is speaking first, sir?
So far, I haven't seen Dr. Lijo.
Yeah, I'm online, sir.
Dr. Lijo is joined, sir.
Great. I just saw you. Right. Okay, Lijo will go first, Prem.
Yeah.
And Srinath,
Sir.
you introduce Dr. Lijo. I have the introductory slide as usual.
Okay.
You're the veteran here. So you start introducing.
Introduction.
Right. I will introduce the chairpersons and then we can go ahead and get into that. All right. I'll pass it on. Admin,
Yes, sir.
are you guys okay? We'll go live.
Maybe the Manisha is still not selected the audio, sir.
I spoke to Dr. Manimaran, so doctor will select audio now. You can proceed, sir, and go live.
Right. You can go live. You go live and tell.
Yes, sir. I will give the countdown first. All the participants, please mute the mic and mute the mobile phone. 3, 2, 1. We are live now.
Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to another Merit Trust webinar on this beautiful Sunday. We are starting summer. It's getting warmer and warmer by the day. And today, 14th March 2021, we have a short webinar with a slightly different program this time. We have cardiovascular disease management through intervention. a little bit of discussion on DAPTs also. And to discuss with you today, we have a very, very light panel. And from Merit Trust, we are always shaping the future of medical education. And we should thank all the sponsors and all the moderators, chairpersons, speakers for their participation. And today what we have is we have chairpersons, special persons who have joined us today. First, we are going to have Dr. Manimaran from Pondicherry, who is joining us for the first time. He's senior consultant, interventional cardiologist, head of the Department of Cardiology, Indira Gandhi Government General Hospital and Postgraduate Institute, Pondicherry. Welcome, Dr. Manimaran. As usual, I'm going to be there hosting you all. Then Dr. Pramod Kumar. He's a very popular cardiologist in Apollo and senior consultant, interventional cardiologist, and his patients just swear by him. What he says, they do. That is Pramod Kumar for you. Then there is our evergreen Dr. Srinath the Great. He's senior consultant, interventional cardiologist, my very good friend from SIMS, and he was also trained in Apollo hospitals. And also there is Dr. K.N. Srinivasan, the upcoming cardiologist from Apollo Hospital, Chennai. Now, with this short name, we will not waste too much of time. We will get into the program. We have about 5 talks today, and the first one is going to be by Dr. Lijo Verghese. And to introduce Dr. Lijo Verghese, may I call upon Dr. Srinath to start first, please.
Yeah, good evening, friends. Thank you, Dr. Prabhakar, for the introduction. Dr. Lijo, good evening and welcome for this
Thank you.
small web meeting. Welcome. It's nice to see you after a long time, Lijo.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lijo Verghese, he is currently working as a professor cardiology and consultant interventional cardiologist at KMCHN Medical College, Coimbatore. So I know him from his CMC Vellore days. Probably we have had a couple of interactions during his training period. We have met, and of course some conferences we have met and interacted. And his areas of interest: congenital heart disease intervention in children, adult congenital and structural heart disease interventions, complex high-risk coronary intervention, bifurcation CTOs, ROTA, more than 20 publications in national and international journals, and he's involved in ongoing research like heart failure registry. So he's off to you, Dr. Lijo, for your topic.
Yeah.
You can take.
Thank you, Dr. Srinath and Dr. Prabhakar. I'll just share my screen. Yeah, the screen is visible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Lijo.
Okay, right. Yeah. So thank you for this opportunity for this case presentation. Today's case is of a retrograde lady CTO recanalization through a bypass graft. So this is a 70-year-old male, diabetic hypertensive, who had CABG in the year 2000. He had a LIMA2 LAD, SVG2 OM, and RPDA. He presented with effort angina for 1 year duration. On examination, nothing remarkable. Investigations were normal. PCG, echo, X-ray, nothing remarkable. He had classical effort angina, so treadmill was not done. And we went in straight for an angiogram. So this was femoral root because post CABG. Left main, there's some minor disease. As you can see, there was a ostially flush occluded LAD. If you can see here, the LAD is flush occluded, and some amount of tram track calcium also can be made out. Here you can see the caudal view. There's ostial circ has got a tight lesion, followed by there's another occlusion. And here you can see some amount of competitive filling of the distal OM from probably the SVG2 OM venous graft. Now this LAD CTO, as we know from the angiogram report in 2000, prior to the CABG itself, he had this CTO. Now this was a blunt stem CTO with a JTC score of 3 and circumflex which is occluded. RCA again is proximally occluded. What we are seeing is probably the RV branch, which has a proximal tight lesion, and thereafter it gives a few epicardial collaterals, and that fills the native LAD as seen in this picture. So LAD is diffusely diseased. What is seen in the picture, LAD mid segment is also diffusely diseased, but it fills from collaterals. That itself suggests that probably there is a problem with the Lima. This was the diagnostic angiogram of the venous graft. So if you see, this is the venous graft, SVG2 RPDA, which is flowing well. That also to some extent gives collateral, transeptal collaterals from the PDA going to the LAD, but not filling it so well, probably because it's well collateralized from the RV branch of the RCA itself. But you can see some amount of LAD filling here. And this is the Lima shot, which actually shows that the Lima is quite tortuous. This is done the lateral view to open out the anastomotic site. And after the anastomotic site, you cannot see any bit of LADs filling. In fact, what you can see probably is a diagonal, which is filling from few collaterals from the Lima. The anastomotic site is completely occluded. Native LAD filling is not at all seen from the Lima. Here we had a peculiar situation. Sorry, I didn't show the SVG2OM, but that was flowing, as you saw from the diagnostic native angio itself. So this was a peculiar situation of somebody who presented 17 years down the line of bypass with effort angina, and his venous grafts are patent, SVG2 PDA and OM are patent, and the Lima to LAD has got an occlusion at the anastomotic site. Now, obviously, so that LAD is the one which is ischemic and causing him the angina. So we had to open up and reperfuse the LAD tertiary. So what are the interventional options for the LAD recanalization? One was actually to go through this RV branch, but most of you would agree with me that it's not going to be easy. For one, there's a tight lesion here. Second thing, it's very tortuous and more likely to end up in complication than reach the LAD. Next thing is to go through the Lima stump and try recanalizing. But the issue here again are twofold. One is the moment you wire this, the whole thing is going to straighten up and you're not going to have any antegrade flow. It's going to be a blind junction. Second thing, you don't have any bit clue as to where the LAD is filling here. Probably a simultaneous injection may show. And besides, you're likely to open the distal LAD. So what about the proximal and mid segment? As you saw in the retrograde filling, there is some filling almost up to the proximate junction, even though diffuse disease. This you're likely to recanalize mostly into the distal vessel and not a good option. Third one was to go through the SVG to RPDA and through this go through the transeptal collaterals and try getting into LAD. This, for example, looked like a fairly good and juicy looking transeptal collateral to go through. So we thought of taking this particular last option. But before we go into that, just a short review of the literature on SVG being used as a conduit. So retrograde CTOs through bypass grafts are extremely rare. These are associated with higher complications. So there's increased chance of graft thrombosis with your, all your hardware sitting there for a long duration of time, unless you closely monitor the ACT. Risk of pericardial effusion, slow flow in the graft, sometimes even graft perforation. And the success rates are comparable since the graft are big vessels. So support is generally not an issue. Sometimes when you have an acutely occluded graft, patients presenting in ACL scenario, there have been instances of going through the graft, using it just as a conduit and opening up the native vessel and doing a PCI for the native vessel rather than the graft, because the graft has excessive thrombus burden. There's a lot of skill and understanding of hardware that is important, and anatomy is also important to see in multiple views. So we went for a bilateral femoral approach. We went for a donor guide of 6F multipurpose for the venous graft. Recipient guide in the left coronary was a left 7 French XB LAD 3.5, both from the femoral. And we did give a short antegrade attempt with a Gaia 2 Miracle 6. We didn't persist really here for more than 15 minutes or so, probably because we knew that this was a blunt stump with a high JCTS score, and also the fact that this is a 17-year-old occlusion as known from the angiogram before the CABG itself. So then we straight away went for the retrograde pathway through the venous graft. And I've not put all the slides, but here this was what went through was a Scion wire through a fine cross microcatheter. And once the Scion wire went through, we got the microcatheter. We didn't have a need to take a corsair because this, as I mentioned, was a fairly big transeptal. The fine cross itself went into the joint somewhere around the mid LAD segment. Once we had the fine cross here, this is the fine cross, we made attempts to get through the distal plaque with a Gaia 2 and Miracle 6. And these two actually didn't cross into the proximal plaque. Probably there was because of the calcific calcium as well as the blunt segment here. And after we're thinking what to do to upgrade to maybe a Miracle 12 or a Concourse Pro. And at this point of time, we actually tried with a Scion. We thought we've tried antegradely enough with the same wires. We've tried digitally also with from retrogradely also with stiff wires. Why not give a channel a try with the Scion wire? And actually, this is the fluorosave of the Scion wire actually crossing through the proximal cap into the left main and into the donor guider. So this probably, you've created multiple channels by antegrade and retrograde attempts, and at some point a microchannel opened up and this has got through. And this wire did go through. So once the wire went through, we took the fine cross microcatheter, talked it into the donor guide, and then we switched over to RG3. Now, we did a POBA, antegrade POBA with a 2 mm balloon over the RG3 wire. But mind you, this wire goes through this collateral. So we cannot dilate beyond this point because this is the transeptal, whereas the distal lady probably is going down like that. So we dilated probably just till the point of the septal origin. And after that, we did an angiogram. This is what it showed. There was some amount of antegrade flow down the LAD, but again, there's a tight lesion here. So we used the RG3 wire remained there itself, and we used a Scion wire and managed to get into the distal lady with a bit of talking. And as you could see, there's diffuse disease into the distal lady. So the Scion wire crossed into the distal lady, and then we removed the retrograde system, and then further antegrade ballooning, and we did IVUS. And as expected, this is the proximal LAD, which shows diffuse. This is after the ballooning, almost a 270-degree arc of calcium. And thankfully, this yielded to NC balloon dilatation. And we eventually had to put 3 stents, which was 2538, 338, and a 418 from the left main to LAD. So 3 overlapping stents, 2538 in the mid distal, 338 in the proximate, and left main to LAD with a 4x18 overlapping. And the corresponding size post dilatations were done as per the IVUS size. And this was the final angiogram, which showed a good brisk flow down the LAD. This is the caudal view. The only thing was not much of diagonals at the end of the procedure. Probably it will take time to fill up. Maybe it was already occluded. As we saw, there were some diagonals filling in that Lima shot itself. So this was the final angiographic picture, and this was the IVUS images post procedure, which showed final stent MLAs of distal LAD 5, middle LAD 6, proximal LAD 8.5, and a left main of 13, and very good stent opposition. Patient is doing well after 2 years of the procedure. Clinical follow-up, no angina. Thank you.
Great case, Dr. Lijo.
Yeah, thank you.
And well planned and executed. Any comments from the other chairperson?
No, I think, Lijo, you have taken a lot of risk in that case because even as such, the coronary provision is limited. So in case if you get into some problem with the graft, I think you are going to be having a definite difficult situation. But I really appreciate your effort, and the result is really good.
Thank you.
It was cyan blue or black wire? Which you tried?
Black.
Oh. Antegrade crossing also you used a cyan blue or cyan black?
No, antegrade we tried with the Gaia and a Miracle 3. Antegrade didn't cross. So then we went retrograde and tried the same. And finally, probably because of multiple small channels which were created
some channels.
Found a small thing. I mean, sometimes, change of wires, change of hands, anything can work.
You need to be lucky also in that day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Nicely done.
Not many diagonals you said clearly, and only the septals. How was the flow, Dimitri?
Dimitri, so final flow was Dimitri only. There was no diagonals. Probably they were all occluded, I think. It's a 17-year-old occlusion. Probably they were all occluded. Yeah.
I think Lima to LAD is filling the one major diagonal already.
Yes, sir. You could see one diagonal which is filling in that shot, yes.
Right. I think that's a very difficult case, well explained and well done. And I think we should progress with the next case. I don't find any questions in the chat box. If there are going to be any questions, we'll come back to you, Lijo, later.
Yeah,
now,
okay, sure.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I'd like to invite Dr. Pramod to introduce Dr. Prem Kumar, please. Pramod?
Yeah, Dr. Prem Kumar is an interventional cardiologist and electrophysiologist from Apollo Specialty. And he has been doing quite a lot of work. And I think his field of interest is complex multi-vessel PCs, CTOs, rotablation, IVUS, and OCT. And he is mostly educated from Chennai, and also he did his DM from Chitra. And Dr. Prem Kumar, please.
I'll start sharing the screen, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you see the screen, sir?
You just started, just wait, double click to enter full screen mode. You started screen sharing, it's still not yet projected. Yeah.
But can you see?
Yeah, we can see your screen. Actually, it's the Zoom that is seen. You have to change to your presentation.
No, I'm showing my presentation actually.
Yeah,
Can
now
you see that?
Now it's good. Now it's good.
Can you see my presentation, sir?
yes, yes.
Good.
Thank you, Pramod sir, for this nice introduction. Thank you for the company people to give me this opportunity. I will, without delay, I'll start the presentation. The topic given to me was actually the physiological assessment of coronary artery stenosis. Coming to the pitfalls of the coronary artery stenosis, if it is greater than 80-90% stenosis, the eyeballing will be enough. But if it is around 50 to 70% stenosis, I think the coronary angiogram, luminogram may not be enough to assess the severity of lesion, particularly this ostial LAD stenosis, ostial LCX, where there is considerable overlap. So then they started putting wires inside the coronary arteries to assess the real lesion severity. So what are the types of physiological coronary artery stenosis assessment we have? We have coronary flow reserve, relative coronary flow reserve, and then fractional flow reserve, and IFR, which is the newcomer. I will stick to FFR and IFR for this presentation for want of time. So it's coming to epicardial coronary artery. And just see that this epicardial coronary artery is just a conduit basically. So what mainly lies is the arteries, small arteries, arterioles, and then the vein. The maximum resistance to the coronary perfusion is given by the microcirculation only, that is arterioles, arteries, not the major coronary arteries actually. The epicardial coronary artery will act just as a conduit to lead the pressure to displaced arteries. Epicardial coronary vessels are just conductance vessels with no resistance. And how come this auto-regulation happens? At rest, we have good blood flow maintained to the coronary arteries. What happens during stress and during exercise? This auto-regulation mechanism comes into action. The microcirculation can go, the coronary artery blood flow can go to more than 5 times during exercise and stress by vasodilation of the microcirculation. So you can imagine the amount of resistance the microcirculation offers while blood flow to the coronary arteries. Is it just enough to measure the pressure proximal to the circulation? If so, then what is the mechanism? Distal peripheral coronary perfusion pressure is not just a continuum of arterial pressure. So what you should do is, if for example you have pressure in the pressure wave measured the systemic artery, a pressure wave will be coming from the heart fashion, and there is passive reflection of the proximal wave in the reverse fashion. That will be manifested in the coronary artery. It is not just a ventricular contraction and reversed by the passive inflection of proximal wave. There is also active compression of the microvasculature by the cardiac contraction, as well as the resistance by the arteries, arterioles, and the capillaries. So myocardial blood flow is microvascular flow divided by microvascular resistance. So this myocardial flow, you want to become equal to microvascular flow, this microvascular resistance should be very, very minimal. So how can you achieve this microvascular resistance very minimal? That is by giving a lot of hyperemia to the microvasculature, by giving lot of this vasodilating metabolites like adenosine. I will tell you about these things later. So give a potent vasodilator agent, reduce the systolic portion of the resistance, reduce the dramatic variation in the microvascular resistance, and then you will get a stable and minimized resistance value, so that your aortic pressure will be equal to the distal coronary perfusion pressure. So FFR can be defined as a ratio of maximal myocardial blood flow in the stenotic coronary artery when compared to maximal myocardial blood flow in the same artery with no stenosis, imaginary. So how will you know that we measure maximum without stenosis? We have the denominator as the mean aortic pressure at maximum hyperemia. So it is by FFR can be measured as PD's mean distal coronary pressure at maximum hyperemia, and then mean aortic pressure at the maximum hyperemia. You have, due to this particular stenosis, we have maximum achievable blood flow to maximum myocardial supplied by the artery is only 60% of what it would be if the coronary artery is completely normal. So normal values for FFR is usually FFR less than 0.75 usually indicates a severe ischemic stenosis. 100%. If it is greater than 0.8, it is usually exclude ischemia with greater than 90% sensitivity. And if it is between 0.75 to 0.8, it is usually an intermediate zone. The circulation strategy is based only on the clinical symptoms. So now how to do the FFR? First, you have to do the circulation, coronary circulation with 200 to 300 mics of 20 intracoronarily, and then take out the wire from the pack, and then flush the pressure wire. Flush the pressure wire first, keeping it inside the wrap itself, inside the loop itself, and then connect the pressure wire to analyzer, and then calibrate it. You have to do calibration before connecting it to the patient or the guide. You have to calibrate it. Once the calibration is okay, then you can connect pressure wire into the Y connector, and then shape the wire for introducing into the particular coronary artery, and then introducing the pressure wire into the guiding catheter. The guiding the pressure wire will be of this shape. It will be like wire, but exact 30 mm only sensor element will be available. The sensor element is not at the tip; it is at the 30 mm from the tip actually, so that to avoid injuries and at the end it should not be obscuring the pressure measurement. That is why. And then now you introduce the wire into the coronary artery, that is in the LAD, this example, and then you have the sensor at the tip of the guiding catheter for taking into the patient. That you have to equalize the pressure first. That's for zeroing. After equalizing the pressure only, you should introduce the wire into the coronary stenosis. So you can see that after introducing it, resting, no problem. But when you give hyperemia by giving adenosine IV, there is a variation. So you what agents can be given. Now, if you want to treat, just disconnect the pressure wire and then do the angioplasty and reconnect the wire, and then you can measure it again after giving adenosine to see whether the FFR has become normalized after doing the stenting. So you should see that a steady state maximum hyperemia is achieved. This line indicates a steady state maximum hyperemia, so that the measurement of the FFR will be reliable. But if your steady state, that PD by PA ratio curve, if it is having so much of undulation, then maximum the steady state maximum hyperemia is not achieved. Then you will have to go for another injection of the IV adenosine again. So these are all the pharmacologic agents which you use: IV adenosine, intracoronary adenosine, papaverine intracoronary. But IV adenosine is the gold standard actually. The gold standard IV adenosine is gold standard, which is against this only. This adenosine, intracoronary, papaverine, and ragnadazone all are assessed actually. The dosage of IV adenosine is 140 microgram per kilogram per minute. And how to dilute it all are given in nomograms, and our company person will be able to help you very easily. It is actually, and it will achieve the steady state in 1 to 2 minutes. Intracoronary adenosine, the dose is 30 to 60 microgram left coronary artery and 20 to 30 microgram right coronary artery. This can be stepped up by 30 microgram increments. We can go up to 100 microgram. Only problem with intracoronary adenosine is it can cause AV block, undesirable. But it's better to have a temporary pacemaker insert into the right ventricle before giving intracoronary adenosine. I have not used the intracoronary papaverine so far. There is one more drug which can be used for this one, but that is not available in India. I think I have not used it. Ragnadazone. It is the adenosine receptor blocker. The advantage is it is a little longer acting than compared to adenosine, so that you will have enough time to do pullback, pushing in the catheter, everything you can do. And it is a single bolus dose, just 400 micrograms at the bolus, as a bolus, a rapid injection you can give. So in special cases, how will you assess the FFR if there is a two tandem stenosis? I have come with a picture actually. See, for example, you have this epicardial coronary artery where there is two stenosis available, or the first stenosis and second stenosis. What you should do is, you should go beyond the second stenosis, place the wire distal to all the lesions, and see the summation FFR. If the summation FFR is less than 0.8, please pull back the wire and assess the local pressure drop across each lesion, and then treat the lesion with the highest focal drop, then reassess the FFR to see if the remaining lesion is focally significant. After treating one of these lesions, the pressure drop occurs, the other lesion will be larger as a result of increase in flow, and true FFR will be lower. But if the summation FFR is greater than 0.8, I think it can be kept on medical management. But if one has moderate proximal stenosis, lesion 1, and severe distal stenosis, Placing the wire in between the lesions will not help you. Placing the wire in between will not help you to assess the true nature of this lesion. It is not the FFR between this place and this lesion. So actually best to keep the wire distally and then assess it and then pull back and see the pressure drop. So it should be measured. Immediately from the distal lesion to distal LAD to proximal LAD. But in diffuse lesions, the pressure drop will be very, very slow and it is not will be steep. It will not be steep. It will be slow upward zone. So that signifies a diffuse lesion. Even if two focal stenosis you have also, pressure drop will be a stepwise manner like this. And what will you do if there is a bypass graft? So I have tried to minimize it in a proper two important scenarios. One is how to do FFR with the open native vessel. If there is an open native vessel, but you want to assess the stenosis of the graft, you have to go not just distal to the graft lesion, but also distal to the anastomosis. But if you have a closed native lesion, occluded native vessel, then you can go just distal to the lesion. That will be enough. That is why you should assess the bypass FFR in a bypass graft vessel post CABG patients. Coming to osteal disease is an enigma. So your guide will always be having a pressure damping. So you always keep the guide outside so that you can your FFR is not overestimated, and also your wire should not be immediately. If there is oscillation, wire can be very well inside the ostium. Your before zero the pressure, but that should not happen. You should keep it inside the ostium of the guide. Be very careful. And FFR, if your wire is just inside the ostium, then FFR is overestimated and lesion is underestimated. And catheter with side hole should not be used, particularly in oscillations, because you may underestimate the damping. You will be already wrong while zeroing the pressures. And during oscillations, try to avoid intracoronary adenosine. And what happens in acute coronary syndrome? In acute coronary syndrome, what happens is lot of this endothelins, all these toxic vasoconstrictive metabolites go and occlude the microvasculature. So maximal hyperemia may not be able to be achieved by because of the impaired microcirculation. So better to avoid FFR assessment in the stenotic disease assessment by FFR in acute MI and thrombotic lesions. What about the infarcted myocardium? The infarcted myocardium, the advantage is if there is a viable myocardium, then the transstenotic gradient only will not be helpful, but also if there is some healthy microcirculation is available, if there is a difference in FFR between the baseline and the hyperemic levels, if there is no response, vasodilatory response after giving adenosine, that means it is a non-viable myocardium. So FFR in multivessel disease, they have found out nuclear perfusion imaging, the assessment of the stenotic of the lesion, stenosis is better with the FFR in multivessel than even nuclear perfusion imaging, because in nuclear perfusion imaging there is no territory to compare, but in FFR you assess each lesion with the reference as the same vessel, not with the other vessel. So FFR is better in assessing multivessel disease stenosis severity than even nuclear perfusion imaging. So you have to be careful with the tracings also. For example, you have this tracing where you have the notch, but there is a pressure drop. You have got a pressure drop, but there is a notch also available. But what happens is when there is a really dampened flow, the loss of notch only, you should take it as a pressure drop, and it is a lesion severity significance. So this is actually false positive FFR sign, because when the lesion severity increases, when the diastolic pressure drops with the injection of the maximal hyperemia, the diastolic pressure notch also goes off. So this is an important observation while you are doing FFR. With the reduction in the FFR value, your diastolic notch of the pressure testing, distal coronary perfusion pressure testing also should go up. Otherwise, it is not reliable. Beware of advancing the wire sensor in a small branch less than 1 millimeter, because that itself will obstruct the circulation. The FFR may not be reliable. The things which cannot affect the FFR, like heart rate, blood pressure, and stable microvascular distribution, usually does not affect the FFR. Lesion is more likely to be significant if the arteries are provides collaterals. For example, you can have a 70 FFR with a for the same type of lesion. For a 70, you can have a 7.7 FFR with a poorly developed collateral, but you can have 85 FFR with a well-developed collateral. So this collateral artery circulation also should be kept in mind while assessing the FFR. There are some cases where you can get false negative FFR even if the stenosis is severe. For example, you have to consider things like pressure damping, and there is no hyperemia. You have given a drug which is not enough. You have used side dose, and STEMI in culprit lesion STEMI, and left main plus LAD when there is FFR epicardial less than 0.6. Serial lesions, you should assess. You should approximation by keeping in between the two lesions. So, what is the working flow chart if you are using FFR? Say a patient comes with clinical presentation. If it is a stable angina, you see the lesion. If it is intermediate lesion, do the FFR. If the FFR is less than 0.8, do the PCA. If the FFR is greater than 0.8, do give optimal medical management. If it is severe lesion greater than 90%, please don't do FFR. If it is 70 to 90%, you can go for FFR. 0.8 PCA, greater than 0.8 optimal medical management. Unstable angina or ACS, usually in culprit heart lesion, please avoid FFR. Non-culprit, you can use the FFR and go for PCA or medical management. So guidelines recommend that FFR can be used to assess the intermediate lesion severity for ischemia at class 1A level, and FFR can be used in multivessel PCA for multivessel disease also in class 2A B level of evidence. For to assess the success of PCA also, you can use the class 2A level. FFR can be used for left main lesions, ostial lesions. FFR can be used for serial lesions. FFR can be used for bifurcation lesions also. These are some of the trials like the FAME trial, FAME2 trial, and DEFER. For want of time, I'll just keep it very short. Most of these trials said that FFR is very good in assessing the lesion severity in intermediate coronary artery lesions. But in a DEFER trial, one more extra point was that if the FFR is greater than 0.8, if you do the PTCA, they do much worse than patients who are on medical management. That is what they say. So in left main coronary artery, better to use IVUS as well as FFR while assessing the patient lesion, particularly a patient who has got left main coronary artery lesion plus a LAD lesion also along with that. Better to have FFR plus IVUS also into it. Coming to IFR, instantaneous free wave ratio. The problem with adenosine is it has got a lot of side effects in patients who have bronchospasm and all. It can cause low blood pressure, and FFR at low blood pressure value is potentially unreliable. So they came with another thing where hyperemia need not be done. They found one wave-free period in the diastole where there is not much of variation in the resistance. That wave-free period can be assessed by a small software which is available with the other company, and that wave-free period it starts from onset of diastole, that is just after the dicrotic notch, and they have got some calculation for it. They found out if it is less than 0.89, that is the value recommended. If it is less than 0.89, it is significant. The patient can be going for PCA. Greater than 0.89, greater than 0.9, it is usually insignificant. So the IFR modality of workflow is it is just normalize the pressures and then advance the wire and then record it. But in FFR, you have to procure the hyperemic agent, normalize the pressure, advance the wire, administer the hyperemic agent, and then record again. The IFR is again validated with compared with the FFR in multiple trials like Advise, Clarify, Define, FLAIR. All of them, they have very good agreement with the FFR, where the 12-month follow-up, the event rates are less when compared to FFR and IFR. IFR again the same type of workflow, where less than 0.89 you have to do PCA, greater than 0.93 optimum medical management. If it is 0.9 to 0.93, consider FFR for confirmation. And if FFR is less than 0.8, PCA, FFR greater than 0.8, optimum medical management. Thank you very much for patient listening. I want to conclude with a small remark. If FFR is less than 0.8, please do the stenting. If it is greater than 0.8, kindly avoid the stent. But if you don't believe the pressure measurement, I think it is better not to do the FFR rather than stenting, even if the FFR is greater than 0.8, thinking that is a vulnerable plaque and there is ulcerated lesion and all. I think usually pressure wire does not lie. I think unless it is measured wrongly, what is measured is better than what you see. I think angiography, what you see, pressure is what you measure. I think I'll conclude with that.
Thanks, Prem Kumar. That was very good. Dr. Pramod, sir, your comments?
No, nothing.
Prem, that was an
good talk.
Actually, what you said, sometimes it can be very confusing. I had a patient wherein he had a borderline LAD lesion. I said, okay, why give adenosine? We do a RFR. And we did an RFR. RFR turned out to be 0.91. Somehow I was not convinced. So I said, okay, we have the catheter, same catheter, we can use it for FFR. So we do an FFR. So we gave an we gave adenosine directly, intracoronary. Instead of preparing for the adenosine infusion, I think we gave. That turned out to be something like about 0.8182. I said, see, we are in the gray area always. So I think we should still try one more. And we did an adenosine infusion. That turned out to be 0.75. So sometimes you have to be thinking, and you really can't go in these just borderline 91, 92 for RFR, IFR, or if you do a adenosine for 0.8182, I think you have to probably push an infusion, and that is what is probably going to be more conclusive. Ultimately, finally, we did imaging on that case. Imaging was very tight, and they usually used to say that Monday morning everybody does imaging. And Friday evening, people do FFR because FFR.
See, that's what you are validating my last end remarks, actually, sir.
Okay. So if you don't want to do FFR because some more times it can be negative. So I think
patients who has got bronchospasm and all is better to use intracoronary adenosine. That has got a very good agreement with the intravenous adenosine. But if the patient has no bronchospasm and all, I think if there is a lot of time, I think the patient should be given intravenous adenosine. That is actually the gold standard. The other drugs are not available. If regadenoson is available, I think it will be good for us because it gives enough time for us and it is not a tedious injection. I think that should be helpful for us, first thing. And what I saw in FFR is that definitely the imaging is over diagnosing the lesion. Definitely, if you want to do the case, I think imaging is best. If you don't want to do the case, FFR and say no. Usually that goes on like that.
You can stop sharing your screen, Prem. One more. There are two questions. I think you have answered them very conclusively. One question was the intracoronary or IV adenosine, which is better. I think you just now answered that question during the course of our discussion. The second question, I think you put a separate slide and told us about how to read FFR in ostial left pain. Probably just a line or two about that for the person who has asked it. Again.
Sir, the ostial lesions, usually the two pitfalls is there. Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
There are two pitfalls in ostial lesions. One is your guide can be deeply engaged. So before zeroing itself, if you deeply engage, you have already underestimated the aortic pressure. So your FFR will be falsely high. Your FFR ratio will be falsely high because you have already underestimated the PA, aortic pressure, by dampening it. So you have to keep it outside first. And then second thing is your wire should not be inside the lesion. Your wire should be just at the ostium of the guide. See, it is very difficult. You have to keep going in and coming outside. That is how it can happen actually. And your wire is actually distal to the lesion even before zeroing calibration. Then again you will underestimate the FFR because your aortic pressure itself is going to be low. So these two are the pitfalls. Otherwise, ostial lesions can be there are very good validations where ostial lesions are very good agreement with the FFR. FFR guided PCI, they have very good agreement with the outcomes actually.
Dr. Prem, I have a couple of questions.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, one is ACS. You mentioned non-culprit. You can do the FFR, right? At the time of primary or after 48?
At the time of primary itself, sir, because you are talking about loss of microcirculation in the involved territory only. Okay. I don't think you will have very bad microcirculation in the other territories also, usually.
Right. So that's one thing. Second thing is, let's say you have triple vessel disease, intermediate lesion, the LAD, circ has a tight lesion, RCA is occluded, LAD is collateralizing the RCA. Now, LAD lesion is 50 to 60%. Now, since LAD is collateralizing the RCA, FFR in the LAD will be different if you revascularize RCA or other way. I mean, will it be?
So you are assessing the lesion in the LAD which is actually collateralizing the other vessel. If you
Correct.
get a collateral inside only, you will have problem actually. You may be falsely underestimating the lesion with a very good collateral to the feeding artery. Some artery feeds it. So you are talking about LAD lesion, which is actually collateralizing the other vessel. Usually, I don't think it does not cause much significance. But what I recommend is, see, this is theoretical. Where does the collateral join? If you can keep the pressure wire sensor distal to the collateral vessel joining,
Ideally,
I think
yeah.
I think that may give a better result than this. So I keep this the other one where bypass grafts scenario into this account actually.
So one explanation which I got was even if the LAD is borderline FFR in this scenario, and otherwise you want to send this patient for CABG, it's still all right because you're putting a lima to the LAD. It's not a venous graft. Lima chance of it will remain patent most likely. So that is one of the explanations that I had got earlier.
Again, sir. Again, FFR is assessed. There is some study. I forgot the name of the study where they did the FFR and then sent the patient for CABG also. What they ended up having is they grafted less and then they went for a minimally invasive bypass because they needed less grafts. And but with FFR, without FFR, there is no difference in outcomes in these values actually.
Right.
That is what I'm saying.
Okay.
I don't think that's the scenario we can take into account actually.
Okay, sure.
2-3 common questions, Dr. Prem, which for a beginner who's doing an FFR, all these doubts I had when I started doing FFRs. One, you're telling about equalizing.
Yes, sir.
Where do you equalize? Do you take it into the coronary, into the aorta?
At the tip of the guide.
At the tip of the guide.
Tip of the guide. Exactly.
Okay. This is second question. Do you normally disengage guide catheter from ostium before measuring an FFR or an IFR or an RFR?
While calibration, you have to disengage first, and then when the wire sensor is distal to the lesion, you can very well disengage. There is no problem.
Disengage. Okay.
Disengage.
Do you routinely recommend it, or
disengage.
you do?
I will disengage.
And third thing, intracoronary nitroglycerin before measurement of an FFR or an RFR, do you recommend?
Yes, sir. I recommend. I have not used it in one patient, but I repeated the FFR study after doing intracoronary nitroglycerin. Actually, it came significant. Yes, that should be the first thing to be done actually. That is recommended by all the senior people in all the studies they have done actually. First 200 mics of NTG should be given. That is what they say.
Okay. Thank you. It's a very good talk, Prem. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question to esteemed panel members. See, most of us have moved to radial interventions compared to the era where we used to all go femoral and then we used to put a femoral venous line for the FFR. So how have you changed your practice? Do you guys still go ahead and put a femoral venous line if you are doing a radial procedure, or you take an EGL or an IGL in the neck?
Yeah.
Or do you make do with a brachial line?
Sir, I can answer this question. See, basically, I have done at least more than 50 FFR cases I have done. But what I found is even if you do intracoronary adenosine, the AV block which happens is very, very transient. And you won't need a patient does not have hypotension or anything. And I have not had any protracted AV block event or patient hemodynamic compromise while giving intracoronary adenosine also. But I have resorted to IV adenosine lately. So I have not had any AV block after intracoronary adenosine, intravenous adenosine.
No, my question was more regarding the administration of the intravenous adenosine, Dr. Premkumar, rather than the AV block part of it, because the usual dictum is adenosine is rapidly metabolized, isn't it, endothelially? So a larger bore venous cannula or a venous line, either a central line or a femoral venous line, would be the ideal procedure of choice.
Brachial, they say large bolus line, large venous line like central venous vein, femoral vein, or you can give a large cubital vein also. A large cubital vein is sufficient, not just anasthesis vein or just distal to the elbow. You should not use. Above the elbow, at the elbow, definitely it is useful, sir. I think that will definitely deliver that much amount of fluid inside. Sure. I think large vein at the elbow is enough.
I think the recommended is 18 gauge at the elbow.
That's a very good point, stating that it is above the elbow that has to be given. One more point about the discussion about the occluded RCA and what Dr. Lijo was telling. If the RCA is going to be occluded, the area supplied by the LAD is going to be huge. So that is more likely to become positive. That is more likely to become positive because the area involved is going to be very, very large. And when the area supplied is large, it's usually more positive than otherwise. Otherwise, ischemia is not going to be.
Yeah, that is an important point, sir. I forgot to mention that in one of the slides. Sorry, sir. Basically, even if there is 50 to 60% stenosis, that is why FFR is more a hemodynamic measurement of the whole thing. Actually, it is not just pressure measurement across the lesion. So, if the area subtended, if it is large, even if the stenosis is only 50%, in the for angiographic stenosis, the FFR can be still abnormal.
Thank you. I think that there is fair enough discussion. I think the next talk is also going to be more or less related to what we were discussing from Dr. Meenakshi. And I think I'd like to invite Dr. Manimaran. Manimaran, you're there? You're not heard at all so far. Mani is there? Dr. Manimaran he's there actually, but he's not talking. I don't know. Pondicherry is in silent mode because of the elections maybe. I don't know. I think after Kiran Bedi left, Manimaran has also become silent. Mani, are you there still? Right, if Mani is not there, I think I'll invite Dr. Srinath again to do the honors. Srinath, go ahead. Dr. Meenakshi.
Welcome, Dr. Meenakshi. Good evening.
Good evening,
So,
sir.
Good evening. So, Dr. Meenakshi is people in cardiology circle don't need introduction. So, she is a consultant interventional cardiologist currently in Fortis Hospital, Vadapalani, Chennai. So, she did her MBBS at Madurai Medical College, MD at Stanley, and DM at MMC. She's very passionate about cardiology. I know because I had the pleasure of working with her at SIMS Vadapalani for some time. So over to you, Dr. Meenakshi. She's going to give us a algorithmic approach to image-guided PCI. Over to you, Dr. Meenakshi.
Thank you, Srinath, sir. Thank you for your words. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Good evening, all senior friends and colleagues. Today, my topic today is algorithmic approach in OCT imaging. So we already know after a lot of imaging like IVUS, OCT, we always have a confusion whether to go for IVUS or OCT. And with OCT also we have a confusion what to see, a lot of MLA, MSA, everything is there. So it's a simplified algorithm developed by Ziad Ali, and it is for how to optimize our PCA. That is the main purpose of this algorithm. So we'll go with a case study. First, this patient is having a diagnostic angiography with a borderline lesion in RCA and circumflex showing a borderline calcified lesion with the OM bifurcation lesion, and LAD shows a bit thrombotic occlusion in the medial AD. So the syntax score comes to 22 and the patient elects to undergo PCA. So with this clinical picture, we'll go with the OCT imaging. So what is the MLD max? This is the algorithm. What is MLD max? So it is like a pre-PCA OCT. You have to strategize seeing the morphology, lumen and diameter, and MLD stands for all these three, morphology, length and diameter. So with all these three parameters which we take into account, we strategize what kind of lesion preparation we are going to do, what kind of stent we are going to choose, and what is the difficulty we will be facing, any other lesion modification needs to be done. So all these things we can come to a conclusion with this MLD. That is the pre-PCA OCT, which strategizes the pre-PCA. And post-PCA we have the MAX, that is the max. So what is max is it helps in optimizing the PCA. So what are the things you have to see in a post-PCA OCT? So one is medial dissection, the M stands for it, and then apposition of the stent, and then expansion of the stent. So this again helps in how much your stent has expanded and whether you have to go for a post-dilatation or not. And if at all you have to go for a post-dilatation, what size of balloon you have to use. All these things you can come to a conclusion with this seeing this max and optimize your PCA strategy also. So why this algorithm has been developed is like you no need to have more confusions and more parameters, and then like you are have many things to say, and you are not very clear on what you have to do. So it is just like a protocol based management or protocol based imaging, where you do pre-PCA OCT and see the MLD, and post PCA you optimize the PCA with seeing the max. So we'll go into what is max and what is MLD first of all. So in a pre-PCA OCT, like this is the lesion, LAD lesion. First we have to see the morphology, then the length, and then the diameter. So first is morphology. Before going into seeing the OCT images, we should know like what is the cut section of an artery. Like if the cut section of the artery, the intima looks like a hard sponge, and then you have the internal elastic lamina, and then you have the media, and then you have the external elastic lamina, which is again like a rubber band, and then you have the adventitia, which is like a mesh. So you have all the three layers with the internal and external elastic lamina surrounding the media. So OCT, you have again the three-layered structure where media is a little bit radiolucent, and the intima is seen as a thick band, and then you have the internal elastic lamina between the two, and then the external elastic lamina between the media and the adventitia, and the adventitia is seen like a mesh of tissue. So when you see all the three layers, then you have a normal layer of vessel wall. So when you have an OCT image, like you have to see first like whether you can see the external elastic lamina and the adventitia, which is the mesh. So if it is seen, you have two options. One, it may be a normal artery, or it may be a fibrous plaque. So if you don't see the external elastic lamina and adventitia, or you have signal changes in the lumen or arterial wall, like what you have to interpret, how you have to interpret. First is like you have a signal change in the lumen or the wall. So if you have a signal change in the lumen, okay, then again we have to go whether it is a high attenuation is there or a low attenuation is there. If there is a high attenuation, then like it is a red thrombus. If it is a low attenuation, it is a white thrombus. If there is a signal change in the wall, then again you have to see whether it is a high attenuated image or a low attenuated image. If it is a high attenuated image, then it is a lipid containing plaque, and if it is a low attenuated image, it is a calcium containing plaque. So we'll go into each one of the images and then see like how it behaves. So what is attenuation? Like you have, it is only a light image that is thrown from the optimal coherence tomographic catheter. So this light image, once it goes through a structure, it gets blocked. Then you call it as a high attenuated, and you don't see anything beyond that structure. In this case, it is called a high attenuation of the OCT image. And if the light rays are broken down, or it is bent, and you can see objects which is beyond the structure which is of your interest, then it is called as a low attenuation image. So this is a normal artery or a fibrous plaque. You see the images which is passing through it, and it is a low attenuated image. So you again have a three-layered structure here. You can see the external elastic lamina and the adventitia. So then it must be a normal artery or a fibrous plaque. That was a normal artery, and here it is a fibrous plaque where you have thickened fibrous plaque on the artery. And again, but even then you can see the three-layered structure. The external elastic lamina and the adventitia are seen very well. So now what happened is like there's some signal changes in the artery wall. Okay. So what is this? Again, when there is a signal change in the artery wall, the lumen is very clear. Then you have to see whether it is a high attenuated image or a low attenuated image. Here you cannot see the external elastic lamina and the adventitia clearly. So then it must be a high attenuated image. And here it is a lipid containing plaque, that is a fibrofatty plaque is there. So you cannot see anything beyond the structure of, beyond the plaque, you cannot see the external elastic lamina and adventitia. So it is a fibrofatty plaque which has a high attenuation. Here again, you can see there is some signal changes in the artery wall and the lumen is very clear. So when there is a signal change in the artery, whether it is a high attenuated image or a low attenuated image. So these are the signal changes, and again you can see the adventitia clearly outside the structure. Then it is a calcium containing plaque. So again, same question is asked. Where is the signal change? The signal change is within the lumen. So the signal change is within the lumen means there is a thrombotic occlusion. Thrombus is there, and whether it is a high attenuated or a low attenuated, you cannot see anything beyond the thrombus. In that case, it is a high attenuated, and then it is a red thrombus because red thrombus does not allow the light rays to be passed across the thrombus. Again, you have a signal intensity in the luminal area, but you can see clearly the vessel wall clearly after the thrombus. Then it is a low attenuated thrombus, it is a white thrombus. So this is a very simple algorithm to say like what is the morphology of the lesion, whether it is a calcium containing lesion or a fibrofatty or a fibrous plaque or a lipid rich plaque, a white thrombus or a red thrombus, based on very simple algorithm like where is the signal change, whether it is a lumen or an arterial wall, and then the next question is like whether it is a high attenuated image or a low attenuated image, and then you classify it. So it's a very simple algorithm. So you have calcium and or like you have signal intensity, and then how you are going to change you have to prepare the lesion. So first of all, like you have a lipidic plaque because you don't see anything beyond the lesion. It is high attenuated plaque. Then it is a lipidic plaque. So in that case, you can go for a direct stenting because the lesion is very soft and it will give way. Here again, it is a low attenuated. You can see the external elastic lamina and the adventitia very clearly. It is a fibrotic plaque, and so here in this case, a compliant balloon can do this job and you can prepare the lesion very well, and you can have a good stent expansion. Here you have calcium because it is a low attenuated signal intensity change in the arterial wall. So you have a mild to moderate calcium, and here you have a severe calcium almost more than 280 degrees of the arc. So in this case, you have to go for a non-compliant balloon or you use an atherectomy device or anything. And here you can go for an IVL or rotablation or anything. So depending upon the calcium, we can decide, and depending upon the morphology of the lesion, we can decide how to prepare the bed for further good stent expansion and for an optimized PCA. What is the influence of calcium on stent expansion, which is by OCT? So again, this is a simple algorithm which creates a score for calcium. So the score is like we have 3 parameters, and like it is a rule of 5. That is, first thing is like you have the calcium angle. If the calcium angle is less than 90 degrees, you take 0 points, and 90 degrees to 180 degree as 1 point, and more than 180 degree as 2 points. And maximum calcium thickness, if it is less than 0.5 millimeters as 0 points, and more than 0.5 millimeters as 1 point, and calcium length is less than 5 millimeters as 0 point, and more than 5 millimeters as 1 point. That is simply called as rule of 5, like 0.5 millimeter thickness below or above, 5 millimeters length below or above, and 50% vessel arc. You have some score of 0 to 4 points. So depending upon this study, that I have found like the score of 3 and 4, they need a good lesion preparation. Otherwise, the stent expansion rates will be very, very less, and you have to prepare the bed in a very good way so that you can have a optimized PCA. So this is a calcium dependent lesion preparation. This is before pre-OCT. The area is only 2.06. and atherectomy reduces the thickness to 2.93, and then calcium fracture at with IVL, the area is again well expanded to 5.08, and after stenting you have a good expansion of 9.38. So this lesion preparation with atherectomy and IVL helps in fracturing the calcium and having a good stent expansion. This is a morphology assessment. It's a normal or fibrous edges, and there is calcium, severe calcium. So the LED lesion which we saw by angiogram, now we have done the OCT, and you can see like the good fibrofatty plaque with calcium also surrounding more than 180 degrees. Next is length. So if you take it angiographically, you may be thinking like you may need a longer stent by regular traditional angiogram, but you do a OCT 3D luminogram, and then like it may help you in assessing like the distal lesion does not needs to be addressed, and you have to go ahead and treat only the proximal lesion. So first is scroll for the reference vessel diameter, like the distal normal luminogram. So you scroll, this is the lesion, and then you scroll in the distal portion, and then you see like where you have a normal place to land your stent. So the more visible the EL, the safer will be your landing zone. Okay. So is it a safe place to land? Yes. And then you scroll to the proximal portion. You then scroll it over and then see where you can see the EL and the adventitia, and that will be the place like where you can place your stent. So this is the distal reference diameter, and that is the proximal reference diameter. Now adjust the length to an available DES. So this is the distal reference diameter where you have all the 3 layers seen of the vessel wall. It is a very safe place with no disease. And you measure the diameter at the place and also bookmark the place. And this is the proximal zone, like where you have a good 3-layered architecture of the vessel wall. And you measure the length between this distal reference diameter and the maximum proximal reference diameter. And the length is around 33 millimeter, depending upon what type of stent you want to use. And you can go to the nearest length of the stent which you are going to use. So this is practically how you go ahead. Like distal vessel you have seen, and then the proximal portion also you just bookmark where you can have a normal 3-layered architecture. Now this is the distal reference diameter, and then you measure the length between the two and then choose the length. Next is the diameter. Like OCT stent sizing, like how you take the diameter. So you have 2 types of measurement. One is like you can take the external elastic lamina, EL to EL, mean EL to EL, and then you can downsize to the nearest stent size. Or if you cannot see the external elastic lamina on the adventitia, then you take the lumen to lumen diameter, like lumen diameter and the mean lumen diameter, and round up to the nearest upsize to the nearest stent size. And again, balloon diameter is also decided by the OCT measurement with the mean EL diameter rounded down to the nearest balloon size. And if you take the lumen diameter, it is rounded up to the 0.25 to 0.50 millimeters above the lumen diameter. This is the OCT guided diameter measurement. This is the external elastic lamina. EL is measured. It's around 3.01. And it's 3.05. Sorry. Sorry, 1 second. So it is a 3.01 and 3.06. So you take the external elastic lamina. So you downsize to the 3 millimeter stent. And this is the proximal reference diameter, which you take it as 4.36. So when you take the EL, you downsize the balloon size to 4. So this is the OCT guided stent and balloon sizing. The distal reference diameter, we already saw it. So now like we have to go for the post PCI OCT optimization. So post PCI, like after putting the stent, you have an interface like the user interface it gives you good view about how the stent struts are seen and like whether there is any malapposition or not. So what are the things which you have to see after post PCI is MAX, that is medial dissection, then apposition, and then stent expansion. First is medial dissection. So address if there is any dissection. You again do a post PCA run, and then post PCA run you see whether there is any medial dissection. If it has penetrated the medial layer and it is greater than 1 quadrant arc. So if it is so, like it has criteria fulfilling all these two, then you have to place an additional stent and then treat the dissections, particularly for distal dissections. So this is like you do a run, you see the distal edge of the stent. The distal edge of the stent is good, there is no dissections, and then you go to the proximal portion. Proximal portion also see whether there is any dissections or not, and then confirm there is no edge dissections. If at all there are edge dissections, if they are penetrating the medial layer or more than 1 arc size, then you have to go and put and deploy another stent, and then you can have an uncomplicated PCA. Apposition, coming to apposition, if the stent studs are in contact with the artery, the stent is well opposed. So address any gross malapposition, that is anything that is longer than 3 millimeter or more than 0.3 millimeters from the wall. You call it as stent gross malapposition, and dilate with a semi-compliant balloon at low pressure and then come out. And for people like even the OCT automatically detects if there is any malapposition, like that will be shown by red marks, and you can go and you can have an angiographic co-registration to this area which is malapposed, and then you can go and then dilate with the balloon and then come out. Expansion, like when the stent is just opposed to the artery wall, we call it as stent expansion. That is, the stent expansion is very well. And if it is not opposed to the artery wall, or you have a reference comparing to the reference diameter, reference lumen area, the stent lumen area is very small, then you call it as the stent is underexpanded. Like this underexpansion, we have a simple criteria, that is a dual criteria. You take a long stent, you have a 40 millimeter stent, to say you have deployed a 40 millimeter stent. Then you divide the stent into 2 halves, that is the distal half and the proximal half. So the distal half, you take the distal reference diameter, and then after the distal reference diameter, what is the minimal lumen area in the distal reference edge, and if compare it with the maximum stent area. So if the maximum lumen area and the stent area are going to be almost equal, then you say like, okay, the stent has been well opposed. Or the same way you can take the proximal reference area and then compare with the proximal lumen area, and then see like how much is the expansion, and then you can say the stent has been expanded very well. This is like measuring the length, maybe again EL to EL. So what is acceptable is like more than 80% stent expansion is always acceptable, and anything more than 90% is optimal. So we want to have at least 90% expansion of the stent compared to the proximal and distal reference lumen area. So again, like if you have a malapposed or underexpanded stent, like how about you go with the balloon sizing? Again, you take the distal reference diameter and then the maximum diameter based on the EL to EL measurement or the lumen to lumen measurement. If you take the EL to EL measurement, then you downsize the balloon size, or if it is a lumen to lumen diameter, you upsize to the nearest diameter and then go ahead and do a good post dilatation for optimal PCA. So this is again choosing the balloon size depending upon the diameter size, maybe an EL to EL or the lumen area. So co-registration, you can take it as a reference, and then the co-registration you keep it and then dilate that portion and then have an optimal PCA. So this is again the repetition, like the MSA in this area is 6.17 and the distal reference MLA is 5.6. So you have achieved more than the distal reference diameter, and so it is more than 100%. So you no need to expand the stent. And again, you have a good stent expansion in the proximal portion also. It is 5.59 and it is almost 100% compared to the proximal reference area. So simplified algorithmic strategy is like pre-PCA. You strategize the PCA technique by seeing three parameters. One is morphology, length and diameter, simply called as MLD. And post PCA, you optimize your PCA by seeing again three parameters, which is medial dissection, apposition and expansion, called as max. So MLD max. These three things you keep in mind so that your PCA will be optimal and you can strategize your PCA in a better way so that you have good outcomes after post stenting. Thank you.
Very nice, Dr. Meenakshi. So you just gave a comprehensive overview of PCI using an OCT. Over to the chairperson for any comments and opinions. I think there is a question in the chat box.
Any update on contrast-free OCT is the question.
Yeah, correct.
Contrast-free OCT.
Contrast-free OCT.
Yeah, contrast-free OCT is like already we have a lot of studies going on with the contrast-free OCT. There are studies doing OCT with Dextran also. But nowadays, the real-world practice, we are using a diluted contrast. You take 10 ml of contrast and dilute with 10 ml of saline, and then you again give it. So in that way, you can reduce the contrast load. It is a very practical way of doing it. Because Dextran 40 again, you cannot use in patients who have renal dysfunction because it again compromises kidneys. So we need more studies on this. And some people are doing saline with very less contrast and then pushing it fast with a 20 ml syringe and having good images also. Maybe in the future we'll have more studies on this low contrast or no contrast OCT. I think seniors can put more light on this.
I have used saline only. But the problem with saline only is we tend to push it like the contrast and it runs before the
acquisition
acquisition is over. So you have to think a little bit and give it a little slow or use a 50 ml syringe because the saline just rushes through it. Images are good. I've had very good images with saline only, and it saves you a lot of trouble if you're doing a 2SL PCI or a bifurcation. You want to run everything and you're giving too much of contrast in between and you have to be a little careful. It is quite good. The images are quite good. I think your talk was so exhaustive, I don't think everybody can have questions, but I think it's a very, very good exhaustive talk on all that everybody needs to know about OCTs. I think we should thank Dr. Meenakshi for your excellent presentation, and thank you so much. And I think Ramesh is there now. I think if Ramesh is there, I think we'll go ahead with the presentation from Ramesh and Dr. Pramod. Can you call in Dr. Ramesh?
Yeah, good evening. Sorry for joining late.
It's okay, Ramesh.
Because I mistook the timing actually. So, can I share my screen?
Yeah, I think we gave a short introduction. It's okay. I'll just do it. Dr. Ramesh is associate professor from SRMC. I think that's he's too eager to start his longitudinal expansion of stent. I think we'll let him share his screen and proceed with go on with things. Go ahead, Ramesh.
Hi, sir.
Hi. So the case actually, this case may not be related to the topic as such, but I thought I will just share this interesting case we had last month. Actually, this patient is an elderly gentleman around 70 years, came with almost aborted antral MI. So when he presented it, there was no pain and FT also was normal. So we took him, because of the COVID time, we did COVID and took him for angio. Angio revealed osteoproximal LAD 90% with the involvement of distal left main. Suck was not that much involved, so the mild block was there. So we decided to send the LAD from left main. So from left main to LAD, stenting was done with the IVOS guidance because we don't have OCT right now, and being a left main also IVOS was better. And we did a right femoral approach. So actually this is a wire that was crossed, and you can appreciate in this image the left main was short, and there was a tight lesion at the osteoproximal, maybe 90%, and there was no parking in the proximal LAD, so we have to send from the left main. And so then we cross the LAD. And this is a shot. You can see there was a mild disease of left main with proximal LAD lesion. My mid LAD lesion was borderline. We did FFR, that was not significant, so we decided to leave the mid LAD lesion. But ostium was mild block, but not significant. So pre-dilated, and you can appreciate once we place the balloon itself, the flow was less. And this is a little slow image where you can see how we are crossing the stent into the left main. So we decided to stent from left main into the LAD. So here you can appreciate we actually placed the stent where we wanted. So you can appreciate just at the upper quarter of the junction we kept the stent, and the stent distal point also was away from the mid-LAD lesion. So we are happy with the position, and so we stented. You can appreciate here we stented nicely. So we are happy with the stenting. So then we decided to post-dilate the stent. So this was the immediate result. There was a carinal shift was there, but that lesion we did IVUS. So IVUS wise there was not much narrowing at the self ostium. And then we did post-dilatation with 4 into 8 mm NC balloon. The problem happened here. So what happened when you try to pull the balloon little back and dilate, that time the entire stent there was expansion, and you can I'm not sure whether you are able to appreciate. You can see here the stent was almost here. So actually the stent was placed here from 3 steps. It was little stretched by the balloon. So when we were inflated the balloon, so there was a light traction of the guide, and the stent expanded along with the inflated balloon. And you can see here the left main is somewhere here, and the stent is almost 3/4 steps are protruding into the aorta. So this image you can appreciate better. So you can see here the stent is almost 4 steps are protruding into the aorta. And this is appreciated better here. Here the stent is somewhere here, and the left main ostium is here, and even you can see the cells are little opened up. So it is not like crowded here, it is almost opened up. And luckily in this also you can appreciate. So the stent is almost some 4-5 steps are protruding into the aorta. We tried to do IVUS, but IVUS was not going, so we thought we will not further damage the stent. And you can appreciate here the distal part is okay. So and the patient remained hemodynamically stable for the entire stay in hospital. Now almost 1 month follow-up, there was no event. So problem now is, if there is any event, how to engage the guide, and how to do a reintervention if needed. So this is probably the second case we had such an expansion, and I feel probably when we inflated the NC balloon, there was a slight traction of the guide, so that pulled the entire proximal part little expansion was there. So that was the reason for the stent. Luckily, there was no fracture. So we are lucky to get away with this patient, and the 1 month follow, the patient is doing well. So I thought I would just share this little, not a complication, so little unusual thing which happened very rarely in this intervention procedures. So I thought I'll just share and ask if anybody had a similar problem, like a longitudinal expansion or opening of the chest with balloon, or what may be the possible cause in our patient. I assume it is because of the inflated balloon that was stretched, but I just want to ask others' opinion also.
Okay, I think you can stop sharing, Ramesh. If there's no further slides, you can stop sharing. But did you do a stent boost after this?
Yeah, we did a stent boost. So the stent boost showed that almost beyond the left main LAD junction also there was some protrusion of 2-3 cells, and the cells were more opened up.
No, the simplest thing I would say was like what I was asking was the balloon within the stent?
The balloon was within the stent. Post-dilatation, the balloon was within the stent, and when we try to negotiate the balloon again, when we try to push the guide to be more coaxial, that time the guide came out and little stretched.
Simplest thing that comes to my mind that has happened before for me was not like this. Like we tried to position it in an LAD, and when the stent, we thought we were in good position, everything, and finally deployed it and found out that the stent was proximal. So I didn't think about stent expansion at that time. Although you're thinking maybe it's a possibility, because I found out ultimately at that point I never found out. But distally was deployed well, proximally was there. What I decided to just dilate it and fix it there, because the lesion was covered. It's slightly longer stent I had used, so I got away with it by just post-dilating it again and again, and then made sure that it was, because those days we didn't have imaging. So this is the only thing that I can think of. But in your case, I don't know. Anybody has had an experience like this, longitudinal stent expansion? I'm not.
What was this stent, Dr. Ramesh?
That was actually Onyx.
Onyx, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, there are different mechanisms. I think you must have read up by this time about stent expansion. So most likely it was something to do with the guide, probably guide or the balloon which got stuck, or the wire-induced tag on that the proximal portion of the stent, which caused that linear expansion. So in case there is no compromised flow, then probably you get away with it. But if it is crowded, then it becomes a problem for us, particularly in the left main. So then probably you will have to do dilatations and make sure that it is expanded properly. But very difficult to get in an IVUS catheter also after this.
Yeah.
So you won't be able to get inside.
We attempted, but it was not going. So then we thought we will not damage the sensors further, so we left.
I think the patient takes a deep breath in the expanded time. That can pull the stent a little bit sometimes. It takes a full breath. That may be one of the causes.
The other thing I wanted to ask you was, like you have a wire inside the stent, and by an end balloon, like what we do an ostial flare, probably you can flare up because you are in the left main, you're in the aorta.
We actually flared up. So after flaring, there is a stretching, like almost the stent stretched more and the cells opened up. So we did flare up with the stent balloon and stent balloon itself, and then the NC balloon, and finally when we tried to make it more coaxial for injection with the expanded balloon, then only there was a further stretching. So everything, all procedure was done. So finally we thought that with the expanded balloon we can make the guide more coaxial. So in the mean portion this guide came out, means almost we instead of pushing, we pulled the guide. So that time the expanded balloon stent didn't stretch out.
Dr. Ramesh, I had a similar incident. Actually, the stent did expand in a similar fashion, but my post dilatation was not complete, and unfortunately, the wire came out. So then that's a big issue. I mean, just like as you're alluding to, if you have to go back, it's an issue. And in fact, while trying to re-engage through this so-called floating stent, the guide actually hit the stent and the whole stent crashed. I mean, the one which was protruding just bent down into the aorta. Okay. So then, I mean, it won't come out obviously, but it sort of bent down, and then actually went through the side strut and then did a post dilatation and left it. I mean, there is a part of it which still is, hanging below. At that point, nothing can be done. We went through the side strut, did a NC with the 4 and left it at that. So I'm glad you didn't chase that further. That would have been the next disaster.
I think all is just follow up the patient. I think like what you say, I think important, you should know when to stop. Don't try to overdo it.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good case for discussion. I think we have one more presentation still left, and I think we should go ahead. We are slightly running short on time, and I think we will. Pramod, can you introduce the last speaker, Dr. Srinivasan?
Yeah, Dr. Srinivasan is a senior consultant in Madras Medical Mission, and he is quite active interventionalist, and I think we should hear it something about the short DAPT. Dr. Srinivasan, please.
Thank you, Pramod sir, for this kind introduction. My regards to one and all in the panel and everybody who is attending today. It's been pretty late in the evening now, so I'll try to make it as brief and fast as possible. So I hope my slide is visible and I'm clearly audible.
Slide, yeah, now you're good.
So my brief today is to talk on the Science short DAPT program and the Science 90 and 28 studies. So the Science short DAPT program based on the Science 90 and 28 studies was presented as part of the TCT Connect in October 2020 and was done by Roxana Mehran and Valgi Mili on behalf of the Science investigators. And the background was DAPT is essential for the prevention of ischemic events after PCI, but inevitably, as we all know, it increases the risk of bleeding. Patients with high bleeding risk constitute up to 40% of subjects undergoing PCI, and as hemorrhagic events following PCI have substantial prognostic implications, bleeding avoidance strategies are vital to improve patient outcomes. And hence, based on the recent trials on next generation DCS, which have shown an acceptability safety profile with short course of DAPT. As you all know, it started with the short DAPT-2 study from Japan, followed by the LEADERS-3 study, followed by the ONYX-1 study in early 2020 with the ONYX stent. And now we have the Science 90 and the 28 studies that I'm going to discuss today. So as we all know, the Science stent platform is a multi-link stent designed with cobalt chromium 605 alloy with a strut thickness of 81 micrometers. And there's a durable fluoropolymer coating with an everolimus being the drug. So in high bleeding risk patients who have undergone successful PCI with the Science stent and completed a short DAPT regimen of 1 month in the Science 28 study or 3 months in the Science 90 study without experiencing adverse ischemic events, they continue to be treated with aspirin monotherapy, and the brief was to find out whether it would be inferior or non-inferior to DAPT up to 12 months. That is the normal standard protocol with respect to ischemic events, and whether it is superior with respect to bleeding strategies. So among high bleeding risk patients who have undergone successful PCI with the Science stent, the primary objective was to evaluate the safety that includes all-cause death or MI of a short DAPT regimen, either of 1 month or of versus a DAPT for up to 12 months. The secondary objective was to determine the impact of short DAPT versus DAPT for up to 12 months on clinically relevant bleeding based on the BARC 2-5 or the BARC 3-5 scale, and to evaluate what was the definite or probable stent thrombosis against the performance goal. So the Science short DAPT program, basically the Science 90 arm, 3 months DAPT, 101 sites in the United States of America. The Science short DAPT 28 days or the 1 month DAPT program had global as well as the study sites from the United States. and a total of 3,600 patients with 1 month or 3 month DAPT. And as I already said, presented by Dr. Roxana Mehran and Dr. Marco Valgimili at the TCT Connect in 2020. These are the various study centers. And what are the inclusion criteria? The high bleeding risk criteria includes age more than 75 years, chronic oral anticoagulation therapy, CKD with a creatinine of more than 2 milligram per deciliter or on dialysis, presence of anemia with hemoglobin of less than 11 gram per deciliter, hematological disorders as characterized by platelet count of less than 1 lakh or any coagulation disorder, major bleeding in the last 12 months, as well as a history of stroke. The angiographic criteria included successful PCI, exclusive use of Xience stents, vessel diameters of 2.25 to 4.25 millimeters, target length of lesion of less than 32 millimeters, and less than equal to 3 target lesions with less than equal to 2 target lesions per vessel. So what was excluded was SEMI at presentation was excluded, LVEF less than 30% was excluded, planned surgery within 1 or 3 months of PCI was excluded, and angiographically thrombus containing lesions, overlapping stents, target lesions either in the LMCA or arterial or saphenous vein grafts, instant restenosis, and CTOs were excluded from the Xience 28 and the Xience 90 programs. So basically, as you can see, in the Xience 90 study, enrollment was done at baseline with the index PCI, and P2 vital inhibitor plus aspirin was continued for a period of 3 months, and then we stopped the P2 vital inhibitor if event-free for 3 months, and then follow-up done for 6 months, and the primary endpoint was at 12 months. The Xience 28 study, again, P2 vital inhibitor plus aspirin for 1 month, follow-up for 3 months with aspirin alone, and end of follow-up at 6 to 12 months. So the primary analysis period for the Xience 90 study was for 3 to 12 months, and for the Xience 28 study was for 1 to 6 months. So total patients enrolled in the Xience 90 study, 2,047, out of which 1,923 were followed up at 3 months, and at the end of follow-up, there were 1,653 patients. In the Xience 28 study, total enrolled were 1,605, followed up at 1 month was 1,546, and 1,375 were at the end of follow-up at 6 months. So as you can see from this particular slide, all the registered patients, most of them, the HBR marker was age more than 75%, as was seen in 65.6% of the Xience 90 arm and the 69.3% of the Xience 28 study. And others, of course, had a multiple of combinations of age more than 75 years, oral anticoagulation therapy, hemoglobin less than 11, history of stroke, creatinine, and history of major bleeding. So the average number of criteria met was around 1.5 plus minus 0.7 in the Xience 90 study, and 1.6 plus minus 0.8 in the Xience 28 study. So this is the baseline characteristics, and as you can see, 86% of the patients were on aspirin in the Xience 90 study, and 90% in the Xience 28 study, and 8.73% and 6% with the DAPT regimen, based on whether it was a 3-month study or whether it was a 1-month study. And the primary endpoint was all cause of death or MI, and basically it was a non-inferiority study where the Xience 90 versus control versus Xience 28 versus control, and the key secondary endpoints were, as I told you, BARC 2 to 5 bleeding, whether it was superior or not, and what was the definite or probable stent thrombosis. And the important drawback that we can say in this particular short DAPT program was the comparative study that was taken from the Xience V study. This is almost 2008 to 2011 data of 8,061 patients from 192 sites, and of course there has been a vast change in our stenting strategies, use of imaging, as well as the evolution of polymer-free stents. So this was the limitation of this particular program. The comparative study was the Xience V DAPT usage from the USA. So propensity controls were matched for both the studies, and what was found was at 3 to 12 months in the Xience 90 arm, there was no major difference in major endpoints, and the non-inferiority analysis did not even touch the yellow line of 2.8%. As you can see in the Xience 28 study, again, Xience 28 arm 3.5% versus the Xience V USA of 4.3%, and again the strategy was non-inferior. the powered secondary endpoint in the Science 90 and the Science 28, as you can see, 5.1% in the Science 90 versus 7% in the Science V arm. In the Science 28 study, it was 4.9% in the Science 28 arm. So, as you can see, the definite or probable stent thrombosis were 0.2% in the Science 90 study, and it was 0.3% in the Science 28 arm versus 0.3% in the Science V match control. So the Science 90 and the Science 28 studies, the present limitations are inherent to the non-randomized design, despite the statistical compensation using a propensity adjusted analysis. And the findings may not be generalizable to the patients who do not meet the Science short DAPT program inclusion and exclusion criteria. The observed treatment effect applies only to patients free from adverse events and adherent to the DAPT regimen in the first 1 or 3 months post PCI. And given that the Science V USA arm was performed approximately a decade prior to this comparison, the confounding factors related to changes in clinical practice cannot be excluded. So, among high bleeding risk patients undergoing PCI with a Science stent, a short DAPT regimen of either 1 month or 3 months compared with standard DAPT up to 12 months resulted in non-inferior ischemic outcomes, similar rates of clinically relevant BARC 2 to 5 bleeding with a significant reduction in major BARC 3 to 5 bleeding with very low incidence of stent thrombosis. So what I will do is I will throw open the strategies to the audience because now we've got polymer free stents available. We have moved away from the bare metal stents to drug eluting stents, and how comfortable are we with leaving our patients on a single antiplatelet, especially ecosprin? So maybe I think we can have a discussion on this.
While you start off, there is one question in the chat box. I'll finish that first. Which antiplatelet can be stopped if I'm planning to shorten the DAPT? Let me finish that. Question is for you, Srinivasan.
Exactly. So that's what I was trying to tell you about, because as far as practice goes and as far as the data we have is if we are using image guided PCI, and as we all know, the markers for acute stent thrombosis is mal apposition and tissue prolapse, while the marker for late stent thrombosis is going to be poor stent expansion. So if you're doing an imaging, and as Meenakshi pointed out, we are using MLD max and optimizing our expansion to more than 90% of the reference lumen diameter, probably we are safe in switching over to a single antiplatelet strategy if required, especially if you are going to calculate the DAPT score, the precise DAPT score. That is very important. So there are two questions here. One, is there a necessity to stop the DAPT? That is the first question, obviously, without which we are not going to discuss this. Second, if at all we are going to stop the DAPT, are we going to comfortably leave the patient on aspirin alone, or is there a choice of putting the patient on clopidogrel or ticagrelor and stopping aspirin? So with whatever data we have, if we have an image guided PCI, probably high bleeding risk patient, there is a compelling indication to stop DAPT. Definitely aspirin alone is a nice strategy. But in clinical practice, what I find in particular is whether we are going to categorize the bleeding risk into GI bleeding risk or non-GI bleeding risk. If it is going to be a GI bleeding risk, then possibly clopidogrel or ticagrelor as a single antiplatelet would be better than ecosprin as far as discussion sake goes. But if it's going to be a non-GI bleeding risk, like an intracranial bleeding risk or other bleeding risk, then probably ecosprin as a single antiplatelet would be safer. So I'd have my seniors to pitch in to what and how they approach this. And
can you stop sharing your screen, Srinivasan?
Yes, sir, I'll do that. Sir.
There's one more additional question to you. Science is also my preferred stent. Is there any specific reason for this better result even with short DAPT? So probably advancements in stent technologies and use of imaging. I think the use of imaging is a major difference. That is what we used to do, say, 5-7 years back compared to what we are doing today. So whether we are going to go in for a polymer-free stent in patients whom we are expecting to have high bleeding risk is another question that is still unanswered, because now we have polymer-free stents as well. So as far as data goes, I think the data that we have currently is from the Leaders Free study and from the Onyx 1.
and the Science 9028 program. So the Science 9028 program, again, the comparison is with the Science we study. So there has been a change in our PCI protocols and how we go about doing. And probably we have thinner stent struts, we've got bio-free polymers, we've got durable polymers, we've got bioabsorbable polymers to compound our agony, I suppose.
Prabhakar, there's one thing. If you look at the TICO and Twilight, the drug they stopped was aspirin. They continued ticagrelor, right? So
correct.
That is again a confusing thing. So what do you continue is also a question. But
I think
those two studies which showed favorable outcomes, they continue the ticagrelor. And the other thing is, it's interesting because see, we moved on to polymer-free and bioabsorbed polymers, saying that the durable polymer is the one which cannot have short DAPT. And then comes Onyx one and this 28 and 90 studies which says that even for fluorinated durable polymers also you can do a short DAPT. So like you said, it's probably got to do more with the better drugs and the skill involved and the imaging probably than the actual stents, I mean, that's what I think.
So probably if you give a good result with a good imaging, good expansion,
Exactly.
more than 90% of lumen areas, probably we are safe enough to stop a DAPT if indicated, move over to the single DAPT. But again, whether it is going to be ecosprin or whether it is going to be clopidogrel or ticagrelor is again an unanswered question as on yet.
I think the most important message you gave is what Lijo has been stressing is, I think if you are going to go on a strategy of a short duration of DAPT, imaging becomes absolutely essential because that is going to determine whether you're going to have a complication. I think that because once you've decided on a short duration of DAPT by the time when you want to stent him, I think if you're going to go for a good stent deployment and make sure that the results are good, the chances of a subsequent problem are going to be much, much less. I think the complication rates are important. I think that should be the most important point in discussion. Whether to stop aspirin or clopidogrel or whatever, can you stop aspirin? Because traditionally aspirin has been the number one drug. Now recently there has been a study published in elective PCIs wherein you can just give prasugrel without any kind of DAPT, even without aspirin. So even from day one, they stopped aspirin. And that showed non-inferiority to prasugrel with aspirin. So stents, all kinds of experiments are being done. But one thing is clear, our technology has definitely improved. The way we deploy stents, the aggressive post-dilatation, all those seem to be making a big difference. And I think that is where the big difference. And shorter the duration of DAPT, obviously the lesser the long-term bleeding risk, even for otherwise normal patients. You don't recommend more than 1 year. Though we are a little worried about continuing for more than 1 year. And there the safest one seems to be clopidogrel, not the ticagrelor, not the prasugrel, because clopidogrel seems to be the safest in long-term DAPT, maybe prasugrel also. And now we are talking more in terms of starting the dual pathway inhibition with rivaroxaban 2.5 twice a day. That, remember, is definitely has got a higher bleeding, but you have to select your patients carefully. And I think all kinds of combinations are coming. But your question, I think, is very interesting to note that for low bleeding risk, it is definitely an option because now we hardly get bare metal stents. So I think you have to go for a regulating stent. Good long-term results. Obviously, I think the best result is going to be imaging. Any other comments, Srinath? Dr. Ramesh? Dr. Pramod, I think, has left. And I think if there are no further comments, I think we are about 15 minutes plus on time, thanks to the wonderful discussion from all my colleagues. Dr. Srinath, thank you so much. Dr. Pramod, Dr. Srinivasan, Dr. Manimaran, who's been a very quiet spectator today. He's very noisy sometimes. I know Manimaran from my MD days in Jipper. And very good case discussions, Dr. Lijo, Dr. Meenakshi, Dr. Ramesh, and Srinivasan. And I think it was very complimentary discussion today, starting with the physiology, then going into the imaging, and then finally Srinivasan saying that we need both you guys to make sure that DAPT is going to work, short-term DAPT. I think it was a very good discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks to Abbott also for a very good sponsorship and very good discussion and meeting. I'm sure the younger generation, people who have attended and the people who have been listening have had a lot of learning points in this because there's so many points made. Thank you so much to all of you. I think with this, we'll call the meeting to a close.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.